November 1884. The first true cold of winter had descended upon the Kansas plains, and the Henshaw family had no home to shelter them from it. Their farm was gone, seized by the Missouri Pacific Railroad under the doctrine of eminent domain. The land their grandfather had broken with his own hands, now buried beneath iron rails and crushed stone. The compensation had been $47 for 80 acres of bottomland, paid not in cash, but in company scrip redeemable only at railroad stores. It was theft dressed in legal language, robbery with a judge's signature, and there was nothing Samuel Henshaw could do about it. What he could do was survive. The abandoned freight car sat rusting in a rail yard outside Dalton, Kansas, forgotten among the weeds and broken equipment that the railroad discarded without thought. It had been a boxcar once, 40 feet long and 10 feet wide, its wooden sides weathered but sound, its iron undercarriage still solid. The railroad had declared it surplus, too damaged for service, not worth the cost of repair. To Aldrich Wainwright, the division superintendent who had signed the condemnation order on the Henshaw farm, it was scrap. To Samuel Henshaw, it was salvation. "They took our land with their railroad," Samuel told his wife Clara as they stood before the derelict car, their 3 children huddled against the wind behind them. "Seems only fitting we take their railroad for our land." It was not stealing. The car had been officially abandoned, struck from the company's inventory. Samuel had checked. He had learned to be careful about such things, ever since the day the surveyors had appeared on his property with their instruments and their writs and their absolute certainty that progress would not be denied. 6 months later, when the worst blizzard in Kansas memory buried the town of Dalton under drifts that reached the rooftops, the Henshaw family sat warm and secure in their converted boxcar, its iron frame anchored deep in the earth, its walls insulated with materials the railroad had also discarded. And the townspeople who had pitied them, mocked them, called them vagrants living in a freight car, those same people would come crawling through the snow, begging for shelter in the home that progress had tried to destroy. The Henshaws had farmed the bottomland along Willow Creek for 3 generations. Samuel's grandfather, Ezekiel, had claimed the land in 1854, when Kansas was still bleeding and the future was written in gunsmoke. He had built a soddy first, then a proper frame house, then a barn that was the envy of the county. He had planted windbreaks and dug wells and turned raw prairie into productive farmland through 40 years of unceasing labor. Samuel had inherited the farm in 1879, along with his father's work ethic and his grandfather's stubborn conviction that a man who owned land owned his own destiny. He was 34 years old, with a wife he adored, and 3 children he meant to raise on the same soil that had raised him. Clara was 31, a minister's daughter from Ohio who had come west to teach school and stayed to build a life. Their children, Thomas, 14, Mary, 11, and little Ezekiel, named for his great-great-grandfather, just 6 years old, had known no other home. The railroad changed everything. The Missouri Pacific had determined that its new western extension would pass directly through the Henshaw property. The route had been surveyed, the financing secured, the political favors exchanged. A farmer's objections meant nothing against such forces. Samuel had hired a lawyer, written letters, even traveled to Jefferson City to plead his case before the Railroad Commission. He might as well have been shouting at the wind. The condemnation order came in the spring of 1884. The family was given 30 days to vacate. The compensation, $47 in company scrip, was calculated based on the land's value before Ezekiel Henshaw had improved it, as if 3 generations of labor counted for nothing. The appeals process, Samuel was informed, could take years and would almost certainly fail. The railroad had never lost an eminent domain case in the state of Kansas. They left in April, carrying what they could in a single wagon pulled by their dun mare, Juniper. Behind them, the house where Samuel had been born was already being demolished to make way for the railbed. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Whether you're in the mountains, the plains, or somewhere the wind howls just as fierce, these lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the crisis finally arrives. Dalton, Kansas, was a railroad town, which meant it was the last place Samuel wanted to be. But Clara's sister lived there, and they had nowhere else to go. They camped in her yard for the first month, sleeping in the wagon, enduring the humiliation of charity while Samuel searched for work. Work was scarce. The railroad controlled most employment in Dalton, and word had spread that Samuel Henshaw was a troublemaker, a man who had fought the condemnation of his land, who had dared to challenge the Missouri Pacific in court. No railroad contractor would hire him. No merchant who depended on railroad business would take him on. He found occasional day labor, digging ditches, hauling freight, mucking stables, but nothing steady, nothing that could support a family. The children suffered most. Thomas, old enough to understand what had happened, grew sullen and angry. Mary tried to help, taking in mending and laundry, but the coins she earned barely covered thread. Little Ezekiel simply asked every night when they were going home. Soon, Clara would tell him, though she no longer believed it herself. The mockery began almost immediately. Dalton was a company town in all but name, and the Henshaws were seen as enemies of the company. Aldrich Wainwright, the division superintendent who had signed their condemnation order, made a point of driving past Clara's sister's house in his fine carriage, his expression one of amused contempt. "The squatters are still here, I see," he remarked to his companions, loud enough to be heard. "I thought they might have found a boxcar to live in by now. That would be fitting, wouldn't it? A freight car for human freight." He laughed at his own jest. His companions laughed with him. The words planted a seed in Samuel's mind that would grow into something Wainwright never intended. The rail yard on the edge of Dalton was a graveyard of broken equipment. Locomotives too damaged to repair, flat cars with cracked axles, boxcars that had been battered by decades of service until they were deemed unfit for use. The railroad simply abandoned them there, writing off the losses, moving on to newer and better machines. Samuel began visiting the yard in the evenings after his day labor was done. He walked among the rusting hulks, studying their construction, assessing their condition. Most were truly beyond salvage, frames twisted, wood rotted through, iron corroded to lace. But some were merely obsolete, cast aside not because they had failed, but because they had been replaced by something newer. He found the boxcar in late August. It was a standard 40-foot freight car built in 1867, retired from service in 1881 after a minor derailment had bent its couplers. The couplers had been salvaged for scrap, but the car itself had been left to rot. Its wooden sides were weathered gray, but still solid. Good Kansas oak, built to last. Its iron undercarriage was surface rusted, but structurally sound. Its roof, covered in tarred canvas, was intact. Samuel checked the railroad surplus inventory. The car had been officially written off 3 years prior, valued at $0, designated for eventual scrapping that had never occurred. Legally, It was abandoned property. Legally, anyone could claim it. Samuel Henshaw claimed it. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now back to the story. Moving a 40-foot boxcar without a locomotive seemed impossible, but Samuel Henshaw was not a man who accepted impossibility easily. He had moved boulders that weighed more, dragging them from his grandfather's fields with teams of horses and wooden sledges and sheer stubborn refusal to be defeated. He rented a team of draft horses for 3 days, paying with the last of their meager savings. He borrowed jacks and rollers from a sympathetic blacksmith who had no love for the railroad. He enlisted Thomas, who was finally old enough to do a man's work, and Clara's brother-in-law, who owed them for the months of inconvenience. They worked through 2 nights using wooden rollers and the patient strength of the draft horses to inch the boxcar off its rusted wheels and onto a heavy wooden sledge. Then they dragged it, foot by agonizing foot, 3 miles out of town to a piece of scrubland that no one wanted, a rocky, uneven acre that the railroad had surveyed and rejected as unsuitable for any purpose. Samuel had purchased that acre for $2. The boxcar was positioned with its length running east to west, its side doors facing south to catch the winter sun. Samuel dug a foundation trench around its perimeter, then used the draft horses one final time to lower the car into the earth, burying its undercarriage beneath 2 feet of packed soil. The iron frame, once a means of locomotion, now became an anchor against the Kansas wind. The conversion took 3 months of labor, most of it performed with materials salvaged from the same rail yard that had provided the car itself. Samuel stripped tar paper from derelict flat cars to waterproof his roof. He pulled still good boards from wrecked boxcars to build interior walls. He salvaged a cast iron stove from a burned-out caboose, its firebox cracked but repairable. The insulation came from the railroad's garbage heap as well, bales of ruined cotton that had spilled from a wrecked freight car, contaminated with mud, but still warm when packed between the walls. He stuffed the gaps with straw and sawdust, creating a barrier against the cold that rivaled any proper house in Dalton. He cut windows into the south-facing wall, framing them with salvaged lumber, glazing them with glass that Clara had carefully saved from a broken depot window. He built bunks for the children along one end, a proper bed for himself and Clara at the other. He partitioned a small space for Juniper, connecting it to the main living area so the horse's body heat would supplement the stove. The total cost, including the land, the horse rental, and the few items he could not salvage, came to $31. By November of 1884, the boxcar had become a home. The mockery, predictably, intensified. Aldrich Wainwright made a special trip to see the Henshaw residence, arriving in his carriage with several railroad officials in tow. They stood at the edge of the property, pointing and laughing at the half-buried freight car with its smoking chimney and curtained windows. "Behold," Wainwright announced grandly, "the future of American housing. When the railroads take your land, simply take our garbage and live in it like the vermin you are." He turned to his companions. "I told you they would end up in a boxcar. I believe I am owed a wager." The officials laughed. They climbed back into their carriage and returned to town, secure in their superiority. In Dalton, the Henshaws became objects of pity and scorn. The boxcar family, people called them. Railroad rats. The women of the town organized a charity collection, not to help them, but to encourage them to move elsewhere. "For the good of the community," Mrs. Wainwright explained. Such squalor reflects poorly on all of us. Clara accepted the collection with quiet dignity. She used the money to buy flour and salt, provisions for the winter that everyone else seemed to have forgotten was coming. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. The old farmers knew. The ones who had lived on the Kansas plains long enough to read its moods, who remembered the hard winters of decades past. They saw the signs that autumn and grew uneasy. The geese flew south in September, a full month early. The cottonwoods dropped their leaves before their time. The woolly caterpillars were banded solid black, an omen that the old-timers took seriously. "Bad winter coming," said Hiram Jessup, who had farmed near Dalton since before the war. "Real bad, the kind that kills." The townspeople paid him little mind. Dalton was modern now, connected to the wider world by iron rails. Supplies could be shipped in. Coal could be delivered. The old fears of isolation and scarcity seemed like relics of a primitive age. Samuel Henshaw listened to Hiram Jessup. He spent the mild days of late autumn preparing. He laid in firewood, cutting and splitting every scrap of timber he could find. He dug a root cellar beneath the boxcar's floor, accessible through a trap door, and filled it with preserved vegetables traded for labor. He stockpiled hay for juniper and corn for the family, working from before dawn until after dark. Clara organized the interior for maximum efficiency. Every inch of the 40-foot car was put to use. Dried beans hung in sacks from the ceiling. Smoked meat occupied a corner near the stove, where the heat would keep it from freezing. Blankets and quilts, many of them donated by the mocking charity of Dalton's women, were stacked deep on every bed. Thomas, who had spent months nursing his anger, finally channeled it into purpose. He helped his father seal every gap in the walls, every crack around the windows. He learned to read the stove, to keep it burning low and steady through the night. He stopped asking when they would have a real house again. Mary taught little Ezekiel his letters by lamplight, using a primer that Clara had kept from her teaching days. The boxcar was small, but it was warm. It was theirs. The blizzard arrived on January 7th, 1885. It came without warning, as the worst storms often do. The morning was cold, but clear. By noon, the sky had turned the color of slate. By mid-afternoon, the wind was howling out of the northwest at 50 miles an hour, driving snow so thick that a man could lose his way between his house and his barn. The temperature fell 40 degrees in 6 hours. It kept falling. In Dalton, the modern railroad town, chaos reigned. The telegraph lines went down within hours, severed by ice and wind. The water tower froze solid, its pipes bursting. The coal that was supposed to be delivered by rail would not arrive. The tracks were buried, the locomotives stranded miles away. The supplies that were supposed to be plentiful were suddenly, terrifyingly scarce. Aldrich Wainwright's fine house, the grandest in Dalton, had been built in the latest fashion. Tall ceilings, large windows, multiple stories designed to impress. It was a magnificent home in mild weather. In a killing blizzard, it was a death trap. The windows let in the cold. The tall ceilings meant heat rose uselessly to the roof. The coal that fed his furnace ran out on the third day. By the fifth day, ice had formed on the inside of his walls. 3 miles outside of town, the boxcar sat solid in the screaming wind. Samuel had positioned it perfectly. The buried undercarriage anchored it against gusts that would have torn a normal house apart. The east-west orientation meant the wind struck the narrow ends rather than the broad sides. The south-facing windows, sheltered by a small overhang Samuel had built, caught what little light penetrated the storm. And the insulation, the salvaged cotton and straw, the double walls of railroad oak, held the heat from their small stove, as if the boxcar were a living thing determined to keep its occupants alive. The family ate, they slept, they read by lamplight and played games and waited. The children, who had been taught to fear winter, discovered that winter was only frightening when you were not prepared for it. On the 9th day, the wind finally died. Samuel was the first to venture outside. The landscape was unrecognizable, an ocean of white, drifts rising 15 and 20 feet high, smoothing the contours of the land into alien shapes. Toward town, he could see nothing but snow. The buildings of Dalton had vanished beneath the drifts. He looked at Clara. She looked at him. "They'll need help," she said quietly. "They called us vermin," Thomas said, his voice hard. "They did," Samuel agreed. "And now they're buried alive. That doesn't mean we leave them to die." He hitched Juniper to the sledge and loaded it with provisions, food, blankets, a spare lamp. Then he set out across the frozen sea toward the town that had mocked him. He found the first survivors on the outskirts of Dalton, the Jessup family. Hiram and his wife and their grown son dug into their root cellar like badgers, half frozen but alive. He gave them food and directions to the boxcar, then pressed on. The next 3 days were a blur of desperate labor. Samuel and Thomas dug through drifts to reach buried homes. They pulled survivors from frozen houses through windows and chimneys and holes chopped in roofs. They found the dead as well, 7 souls who had not survived the cold, including 2 children who had frozen in their beds while their parents burned their furniture, trying to keep them warm. One by one, the living were brought to the boxcar. It was too small to hold them all comfortably, but comfort was not the point. Survival was. They packed in like cordwood, sharing body heat, sharing provisions, sharing the warmth of a stove that had been salvaged from railroad scrap. Aldrich Wainwright was among the last to be rescued. Samuel found him in the ruins of his grand house, huddled in the cellar with his wife and 2 servants, wrapped in frozen bedding, barely conscious. His expensive furnishings had been burned for heat. His fine clothes were ruined. His pride was utterly broken. Samuel dug him out without a word. He loaded the man onto the sledge beside his wife, covered them both with blankets, and drove them to the boxcar. At the door, Wainwright stopped. He stared at the half-buried freight car, at the chimney pouring smoke into the gray sky, at the faces of the people inside who were watching him with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. "I cannot," he whispered, "to accept charity from the vermin you condemned," Samuel finished. His voice was calm, without anger. "Mr. Wainwright, this boxcar holds 27 people right now. We have food for another week if we ration carefully. You can come inside and live, or you can stay out here and die. The choice is yours, but your pride will not keep you warm." Wainwright's wife began to weep. After a long moment, Wainwright bowed his head and stepped inside. 34 people sheltered in the Henshaw boxcar during the Great Blizzard of 1885. The car was 40 feet long and 10 feet wide, 400 square feet for 34 souls. It was cramped beyond imagining, the air thick with breath and bodies, the privacy non-existent. But it was warm, and everyone inside survived. The thaw came in late January. The snow began to melt, revealing the devastation beneath. Dalton had been gutted. Half the buildings were damaged or destroyed. The railroad infrastructure, the water tower, the depot, the switching yard, was in ruins. The iron tracks, the symbol of progress that had taken the Henshaw farm, lay buried under debris that would take months to clear. A gathering was called in February, held in the open air because no building in Dalton was fit for assembly. The survivors stood in the mud and the meltwater and took stock of what remained. Aldrich Wainwright asked to speak. He was a diminished man, his frock coat stained and torn, his bearing stripped of its former arrogance. He walked to the front of the assembly and stood there for a long moment, unable to meet the eyes of those who watched. 2 years ago, he finally said, I signed an order that took the Henshaw family's land. I told myself it was progress. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself that their loss was insignificant compared to the greater good of the railroad. He paused, his voice breaking. Then I laughed at them. I called them vermin. I mocked them for living in a boxcar, the very boxcar that sheltered me when my own grand house failed. I would have died in that cellar. My wife would have died. We are alive because of the people I wronged. He turned to face Samuel and Clara, who stood with their children at the edge of the crowd. Mr. Henshaw, Mrs. Henshaw, I have nothing to offer you but my shame and my gratitude. You owe me nothing, less than nothing, and yet you saved my life. I have been a proud man and a cruel one. I see now what that pride was worth. He bowed his head. I am sorry. Those words are pathetically inadequate, but they are all I have. I am sorry. The assembly was silent. Every face turned toward the Henshaw family. Clara stepped forward. Her voice was steady and clear. Mr. Wainwright, we did not save you to receive an apology. We saved you because you were dying, and we could help. That is what neighbors do. She looked around at the faces of those who had mocked them, pitied them, called them vagrants. We have all lost something in this storm. Some of us lost property. Some lost loved ones. But we are still here. We are still a community, if we choose to be. She reached out and took Wainwright's hand. Let the past lie buried under the snow. We have a town to rebuild. Thank you for watching this story about the Henshaw family and their boxcar home. When the powerful take from the powerless, they rarely consider what the powerless might build from the wreckage. If this story reminded you that home is not what we are given, but what we make, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, have you ever built something meaningful from what others threw away? The railroad never returned to Dalton. The blizzard had damaged the line beyond economic repair, and the company chose to reroute rather than rebuild. The town that had been created by the railroad was abandoned by it, left to find its own way forward. Many residents left. They followed the rails to other towns, other opportunities, other chances to be part of progress. But some stayed, those who had weathered the storm together, who had learned what community truly meant. The Henshaws stayed. Samuel used the skills he had developed, converting the boxcar to help rebuild Dalton. He taught others how to insulate against the cold, how to anchor structures against the wind, how to build homes that would endure. The Henshaw method, people called it, half in jest at first, then with increasing respect as those homes proved their worth, winter after winter. Aldrich Wainwright stayed as well. He could not bring himself to leave, not after what had happened. He sold his remaining assets and used the proceeds to fund the reconstruction, working alongside men he had once dismissed as beneath him. He never fully regained his old position, but he found something better, the respect of people who had seen him humbled and seen him rise again. The phrase boxcar thinking entered the local vocabulary. It meant finding value in what others discarded, building new from old, refusing to accept that a setback was the same as an ending. The Henshaw boxcar still stands, preserved now as a museum piece in what is today a small Kansas town that few have heard of. Visitors can walk inside and see how a family of 5 lived through the worst winter in recorded Kansas history. The bunks are still there, the stove, the salvaged windows that face south to catch the winter sun. Above the door, carved into a board that Samuel salvaged from his grandfather's demolished barn, are words that have weathered more than a century. They meant it for scrap. We made it a home. Clara suggested the inscription. Samuel did the carving. Their grandchildren still repeat the words to visitors, explaining what they mean, keeping the story alive for another generation.